for those of you on the inside on the podcast, we actually have a producer. Now, you don't see or hear her, which is probably good, but she is doing some really excellent work. So she did so well on this episode. We're actually going to split this into two. So you're going to get a bonus episode this week, and look out for that. This week's topics include Orsted buys out New Jersey's PSEG for Ocean Wind 1 in the U.S. Atlantic, and Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy puts together a plan of how to get American offshore wind and onshore wind rolling.
On the heels of that, something we've been talking about kind of regularly over the last few months of the Jones Act and some of the other things that the U.S. needs to get in shape for making these offshore goals happen is we talk about this American Offshore Worker Fairness Act. That's a bipartisan act to try to close up some loopholes to ensure that the people going offshore do have American passports.
And Phil Totaro from IntelStor joins us for this episode, so it's nice to have Phil back on the podcast. I'm Alan Hall, president of WeatherGuard Lightning Tech, and I'm here with my good friend from Wind Power Lab, Joel Saxum, and this is the Uptime Wind Energy Podcast. All right, some big news out of New Jersey. Danish developer Orsted, who we know well, has signed a deal with U.S. energy company PSEG, Public Service Enterprise Groups, which was my power provider when I lived in New Jersey. So they're buying the 25% stake PSEG has had in the 1.1 gigawatt Ocean Wind 1 project off the coast of New Jersey. Orsted will now own 100% of that project once this transaction is complete. PSEG's chief commercial officer, Lathrop Craig, said that it had become clear that it was better for his group to step aside and allow, quote, better positioned investor to join the product so that it can proceed with an optimized tax structure. That's a very weird language, but Ocean One is still planning to use GE Haliade-X 12 megawatt wind turbines that have run into patent issues with Siemens Gamesa. So we have Phil Totaro from IntelStor back on the program because he has some interesting insights into this, and it really gets down into who's a good investor, who's not a good investor, and the effect some of these patent disputes are having on the industry. Phil, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for having me.
So what's some of the background between Orsted, PSEG, and the GE wind turbines? What's driving some of this now after this project was essentially underway?
It's an interesting question, Alan, because the PSEG about 3 or 4 months ago, at the beginning of November last year, publicly stated that they had not yet made a final investment decision on the project and that they were going to reevaluate their involvement. And their CEO publicly came out and said that, there are legitimate concerns on their part to participation in such a large-scale project, not only phase 1, but there's an additional phase 2, which I believe is another like 1.2 to 1.4 gigawatts as well, that has been planned for Ocean Wind. So is there something in particular related to PSEG, keeping in mind that this company has been involved in renewable energy for a while? They are owners of 4 solar parks. They're also power off-takers from some of the renewable energy that's already generated in the state of New Jersey, and I think a little bit from Maryland as well. So there's, is it really a capital allocation issue that they're running into, or was it something else? So publicly, what they've obviously come out and said is, we feel that there's other companies that would be better positioned from a tax equity standpoint. I don't know that that's necessarily true or not, but obviously this is a decision that they've taken at least, again, what they're saying publicly. Privately, what I can convey to you is that there have been a lot of internal discussions amongst not just PSEG, but a number of developers who were contemplating utilizing the GE Haliade wind turbine for their offshore wind projects in some of these places in the New York Bight, North and South Carolina, Virginia, etc. Different places up and down the eastern seaboard, where there were big plans for that GE turbine to be utilized. They had something like an additional 10.8 gigawatts worth of non-firm orders, but basically, preferred supplier agreements had been signed, even if it hadn't been publicly announced, according to our data at IntelStor. And so this is an interesting kind of turn of events for PSEG to pull out after having also kind of publicly acknowledged a bit of the embarrassment of being involved in a project that ran into these kind of patent issues as well. It turns out there are indeed consequences sometimes to, a patent infringement litigation.
So do you think that, so as part of the due diligence activities, right, if they're going to be a part of the whoever invests in it and whoever brings it on, in their due diligence activities, are they digging that far? Like, is that what when you say public embarrassment, my thought is that did their engineering group not do their homework on what's actually going on there? Or
you know what? It's not just them as a prospective investor. The wider issue that I've been banging on about, Joel, for the last 13 years in the industry is that nobody makes it a point to do, when you think about the scope of what's involved in like a financial due diligence for a renewable energy project, especially like a 1.1 gigawatt offshore project like Ocean Wind 1, you think about all the technical requirements that need to be met, et cetera, and then there's intellectual property risk, which is just as big of a commercial risk to a lot of companies, more so than they are willing to acknowledge and realize. But it's one or two little line items in a turbine supply contract that says there will be partial indemnity provided for the project developer and subsequent asset owner, from the OEM for patent infringement liabilities. And basically these big multinational corporations don't have anything like patent insurance. Such things technically exist, but they aren't widely utilized, certainly not in renewable energy. And the bigger question is, well, why, when we're going to all this trouble, doing all this financial due diligence, do we not take more time to look through intellectual property risk as a legitimate technical and commercial risk in the same way that you do with designs, with, financeability, with, all these other considerations that go into an FID.
Yeah, makes sense.
Is the driver then, if I have made a contract with GE for these turbines, right, and I'm PSEG, and I'm looking at this, and I'm going, oh boy, I'm not sure when. I'm sure I'm going to have to pay GE to start making the turbines. I'm not sure when I'm going to receive them. They may have to do a rework, redesign. There's castings involved. It's a complicated patent dispute, so it's sort of deep down in the turbine. Does that then just say, hey, I got a better use for those funds? Is that what it ultimately comes down to, is that the financial people step in and say, I have, say, $100 million tied up in this. I could put that towards a solar farm tomorrow, and we're out? Is that where it goes?
Yes and no. So I want to get back to this specific issue with Ocean Wind 1, which is
right.
They already had been granted a carve-out by the judge in this patent
to use these
for GE.
I thought it was just Vineyard. I thought there was only two projects that had that. Was this one of them?
This was one of them. There were these two. This was the other one.
Okay.
So just, again, that's a good question, though, because to clarify, originally the judge was only going to grant the concession and the exemption to the injunction for Vineyard. And then, the GE got involved. They got the state attorney general in New Jersey to actually write letters of support to the judge, and they're basically asking for a carve out for Ocean Wind 1 since the turbine supply contract had already been signed. The bigger point, though, is, and it goes back to the question, well, why would PSEG reconsider? They had plans, obviously, to invest in phase 2 and also to be able to utilize, specific technologies and capabilities here. They were trying to do things to attract investment to the state of New Jersey for, different factories that were going to be built for, subcomponent supply chain. They could even theoretically have gotten GE to have made a commitment to build some nacelles in New Jersey and do some of the assembly there. And so the point is that now, with Ocean Wind 1 and Vineyard being the only two projects out of, again, more than 11 gigawatts worth of, firm order book and preferred supplier agreements that were signed, you're talking about, it's a small percentage of the overall pipeline that GE was anticipating, and now they can't sell the turbines that they have. It's funny because, Siemens made the argument, they can sell the 6 megawatt version of the Haliade turbine, but everybody already knows that that's an uncompetitive product. That's why GE stopped manufacturing it after they bought it from Alstom, and they were only deploying it. Obviously it went into Block Island, but they were only deploying it in France because that was the commitment that they had already made to the French government for the jobs and the manufacturing, et cetera, that was happening over there. So when you also consider that GE's 16 megawatt plus designs, anything bigger than the 12 megawatt basically, was all based on derivative designs and technology from the Haliade-X 12 megawatt turbine design, they're kind of stuck right now with being able to sell anything for these offshore projects. So my point, going back to what I was suggesting earlier, there are a lot of developers in the background since the injunction happened about 6 or 7 months ago. There are a lot of developers in the background that are scrambling around right now trying to figure out alternative turbine supply if they had been intending to work with GE. And beyond that, they're also considering what I just mentioned with PSEG and New Jersey. They want domestic production, they want local jobs, they want a tax base to be created. There's a lot of ancillary things that are tied into, a project going forward. And so for any one company not to be able to sell their products and services is a bit of a disaster for just the whole industry, not just GE.
New Jersey has been very proactive, though, in terms of the state itself. The governor has been aggressively trying to set up the seaports and getting all the land cleared and doing the things that New York State has been unable to do, and Massachusetts on some levels also. But New Jersey seems to be going full steam ahead. Was that trying to help PSEG stabilize this a little bit? There had to be rumors going around about it for the last couple of months. And I know New Jersey in the last 6 weeks has put out, I've seen news articles about it, how aggressive they are in working with local townships and trying to push through some of these wind infrastructure pieces. So what does New Jersey do now?
No, it's a fantastic question. And also keep in mind that they were, and I believe still are, planning to use a thermal plant that PSEG was running or is still running. I'm not sure if it's still operational or not, but they're intending to use the thermal plant grid interconnection to tie into the offshore wind park, Ocean Wind 1, and any subsequent projects. So the point is PSEG was supposed to be intrinsically tied into this whole project. They're still going to be, in an ancillary way, tied into the project, just not as a co-investor. Which again, I mean, I'm willing to take it at face value that there were probably certain financial considerations that went into this. And I'm not trying to suggest that the patent dispute was the only reason they decided to pull out or something. No. But it's a contributor. And it doesn't get talked about a lot because the industry, for more than a decade, has just wanted to try to gloss over a lot of these issues. But there have been, huge patent disputes that have cost companies billions of dollars. Companies have left the industry as a result of patent disputes in the past. And it's something that really, we all need to be able to work together to attract investment to renewable energy in general and wind energy in particular. You're now seeing a situation where a US-based company is pulling out of yet another US offshore wind project, leaving, I don't even know what's left for other than Invenergy, which is technically, majority owned by a Canadian company. I don't know that you have very much U.S.
Dominion?
investment and U.S. involvement.
Dominion's the only one.
Yeah, Dominion. You're right. I mean, and it's a bit confounding. Obviously, we in the United States, we need to be able to rely on European expertise because they built, 40 gigawatts and have, built 25 gigawatts and have a total of 40 in their pipeline right now, plus China, which has a lot more. But the point is they have the experience. We need to be able to leverage that. But where are all the enthusiastic, U.S. corporations, utility companies, investors that are, lining up to get behind offshore wind energy?
Yeah, it's too risky. Like even look at this as like I can't remember what the exact number was. For some reason, there's a value of $23 million. It sticks out in my head, but I think that's what it was costing for Vineyard Wind. But it was X amount per megawatt that the judge was. It wasn't just you're allowed to use these. There was also a cost to it. So that cost is minimal, to be honest, in the grand scheme of this project. This project's going to be hundreds of millions of dollars, right? But there's still 25% of that fee that they've got to pay rate. They'd have to pay a rate like that anyways. And in the other side of it, I look at this again, I say the grand scheme of things. Orsted knows what they're doing, operations, maintenance, construction, TFA wise, like to get this thing going. Yes. And PSEG has no clue. Besides being the guys on shore holding a flag going, here's where the interconnect is. They don't have any business doing this.
Yeah.
So there's risk there too.
Well, and this also ties into a bunch of other things. Well, yeah, Joel, you nailed it on the head, which is the IRA bill. There's a lot of incentives about American this, American that, setting up job programs, setting up all the onshore piece to the offshore, and which I'm sure PSEG was tied into doing. That's I think it's why the discussion about the tax structure comes in, because they're the American company. They can do those things that probably Orsted probably doesn't want to do or would have more difficult time doing because they're just not established like PSEG is. So that kind of goes away, though. I mean, if longer these projects kind of hang around and get difficult, why is PSEG involved in it? And we're seeing that sort of play out throughout up and down the East Coast at the moment, weirdly enough, which is frustrating to say the least.
I still, of this article, the thing that we still haven't completely sorted out here is that statement of so that it can proceed with an optimized tax structure. It doesn't make sense to me that they would leave and the optimized tax structure would help. You would think that you would want more involvement from an American company.
Guys, I'm going to roll over to Siemens Gamesa. So if you're all watching LinkedIn this week, Siemens Gamesa put out that big plan about American wind energy. It's called the Siemens Gamesa Scaling Up the American Wind Industry Plan. And it lays out what Siemens Gamesa sees as the road forward for U.S. wind. Now, I think this sort of plays into some of the difficulty that everybody is having. And as an OEM, I'm sure Siemens Gamesa sees it every day. But I'll give you the bullet points. I'll try to summarize a little bit because they're kind of long. But first one, provide expedient clarification on U.S. tax incentive programs to give developers and manufacturers the flexibility to become eligible and promote wind energy deployment consistent with statutory requirements and objectives. This has to do directly with the IRA bill and the tax rules that are not defined by the IRS yet and the Treasury Department, not defined. So if you're PSEG or PSEG and you don't have those tax rules laid out in front of you, all this is just ephemeral. It's not real yet. And Siemens just pointed that out. So the other piece of what Siemens' plan was acknowledge the impacts of long duration between the auction results and when the project's going to kick off, and that inflation is going to happen in between there, and having some compensation mechanisms, maybe refunding some of the auction fee. It seems like where that was going. Connecting communities across the country to employment opportunities, provide public support for workforce development programs, maximize clean energy deployment over the next 10 years by streamlining the permitting process, which again is a federal government issue. And then incentivize the construction of transmission infrastructure to bring new and pending wind energy capacity online, which is why PSEG was involved in this project to begin with, like Phil pointed out. So I think some of the things that everybody is seeing are what also Siemens Gamesa is bringing to the table in this roadmap. It's odd that American Clean Power didn't raise this, but Siemens had to do it. What is happening at the moment? Are we just not clicking on all cylinders yet, or firing on all cylinders? Are we just disconnected? Are we in a pause period waiting for tax rules to come out? What's happening?
So the three things there, right? Tax rules, the workforce in development engagement, and getting things on transmission line projects moving to get it all connected, right? That's what it boils down to.
Yeah.
And all those things are issues. They're not issues that are only specific to the IRA bill and clean energy. Those are issues that we have as a problem from a government standpoint in the U.S. across the board.
Does that get to Phil's point of there's not a lot of American investment in American offshore wind? And
there isn't in American offshore wind, but there's investors like certainty and investors like low risk and high margin.
Right.
And those are things that you're not quite, again, to Joel's point, there's still a lot of risk associated with certain aspects, particularly of offshore wind. But even addressing the onshore issue, there's been a disconnect in the past decade between what's going on in your local municipalities and even at the state level versus federal policy. And we've long tried as a country to get with, ACP and its predecessors to get some type of federal policy put in place that would provide, long-term PTC guarantees and renewable energy portfolio standards, et cetera, all these lovely things that, in a bit of a piecemeal way, the IRA has attempted to do.
True.
However, the disconnect between federal government and federal policy and state and local municipalities is there are, in Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Iowa, you have local townships and counties that are banning wind energy development in those townships and counties. And from that perspective, and this goes back to my comment, a decade ago, the predecessor to ACP was doing a lot of grassroots work, working with people at the state level.
Right.
In the past decade, there's been a shift towards let's focus on federal policy, and they've had several federal policy wins, you could say. But what's the point of a federal policy if we can't execute it by going and getting steel in the ground because these local municipalities have banned wind energy development?
Right.
So I think there's a need to get back to some of the grassroots, and that's one part of it. Although Siemens, going back to the whole point about the Siemens Gamesa roadmap, they don't explicitly talk about that. But one of the things that is an enabler to, more, or addressing the question of why did Siemens write this roadmap and not ACP or not in conjunction with ACP, is Siemens Gamesa has had a specific issue where they've been losing market share to Nordex in the past few years because, you've got companies that routinely just buy, GE and Vestas turbines. And then there's all the other deals that are maybe less favorable project sites where Siemens Gamesa and Nordex have had to kind of scrap it out against each other. And Nordex has been winning lately. And Nordex has been doing that because they've been undercutting Siemens on price. So Siemens is kind of looking at this where, hey, we've got this whole factory that we put in place in Kansas. Nacelle factory, we've got blade factories throughout the Midwest and Iowa, et cetera, as well.
Right.
We're having to, stall and shutter these factories, although now they're talking about reopening them because they've gotten some orders. But they're trying to motivate everybody that's a stakeholder in with this roadmap. They're trying to motivate everybody to get the industry reinvigorated so that they can do what they're trying to do: reopen their factories, create the jobs, create the tax base, et cetera, all these things that everybody claims they want. So going back to my point as well about all these townships that are banning wind energy, the reason that, frankly, a lot of that's happening is it's not just NIMBYs and disinformation that's which has certainly been prevalent. You're also talking about, like, if it's getting cheaper and cheaper to build projects, and project capex has gone down, it's bounced back up a little bit off the bottom, corresponding with PPA prices and commodity costs and input costs for turbines and whatnot. But if it's getting cheaper and cheaper, they're not offering as much in the way of easements and lease payments to landowners. They're not offering as much commercial incentive to the local communities. These are all things that the project developers need to be able to do to smooth things over, because if your neighbor is getting $5,000 a month and their wind turbine that's on their land has got shadow flicker onto your property, you're going to be upset about it if you're not getting $5,000 a month. But if you are, then guess what? That $5,000 a month goes a long way to easing your discomfort over
your
shadow
seizures.
flicker and noise and acoustic emissions. Yeah, supposedly. So it's amazing. I guess it's amazing what money does, but so that's a very long-winded explanation of some of the things that are kind of transpiring at this point. But there are definitely, for Siemens Gamesa to feel like they have to come out with their own roadmap that the ACP wasn't a part of, there's got to be some kind of a disconnect there between these one of the top 3 OEMs in this country and supposedly the leading champion of the industry in terms of the lobby group in the United States as well. So it just kind of feels like everybody's not quite aligned on the same path.
You can expect to see a large presence of the two of them in Orlando at the ACP O&M conference here coming up in March, because that's where the majority of the Siemens team is. So maybe we'll see some communication there.
Of course.
I was thinking about this. Yeah, maybe some fireworks.
Could be exciting.
Alan, a few months back we talked about it was a federal effort to install basically 80,000 new IRS agents. Yes, 87,000. So I think at that, maybe that's why I'm saying 80, because I think I remember the comment where I was like, maybe they should just take 7,000 of them and help them move that effort into permitting, like permitting for transmission lines, permitting for other energy projects. Like, just everybody talks about it, whether you're onshore or you're offshore or wherever. And this is one of the things from the Siemens plan is just getting these projects. Like, there's so many things in the queue to hook up to the grid that there's not enough time and in the day to get them all moving. So, that's a big problem that Siemens is pointing out. ACP has pointed that out, and maybe not in the same capacity, but has as well. It's something that we need to address as a industry. Or that's not an industry problem. That's a government problem, I guess.
Well, it's a government problem, which has become an industry problem.
Yeah.
That's the real issue. And until some of these items get closed, and I don't see closure coming in the next 6 months to a year, it's going to be a big pain point. And I expect GE and Vestas and others to chime in on this with probably similar looking plans. And that's good. At least we understand where they're coming from.
I'd like to see more effort from some of these larger groups in the workforce development as well, because from being in the industry as we all are, you hear it from every corner. We can't find enough people. We can't find enough people now. So you're say you're working blades, right? You got to find someone that is competent and trained and understands composites and all this stuff. And then you also have to have that exact same person and the ability to work on ropes or at heights and away from their families. And so like, it's hard to find those specific people. But if we can start training them, if we can start injecting some, into some STEM programs at young ages, or into some of the, it's going to have to be from the high schools and on up to get these things moving, because just trying to repurpose and switch people into different industries, it's a tough industry to get into because of the travel and time away from home. And not everybody has a wind farm out their backyard where they can just drive to work every day and work at it, Yeah.
Lightning is an act of God, but lightning damage is not. Actually, it's very predictable and very preventable. Strike Tape is a lightning protection system upgrade for wind turbines made by WeatherGuard. It dramatically improves the effectiveness of the factory LPS, so you can stop worrying about lightning damage. Visit weatherguardwind.com to learn more, read a case study, and schedule a call today.
All right, so the American Offshore Workers Fairness Act has been banging around Congress since last year. Right, and so the legislation is sponsored by Louisiana Republican Garrett Graves and California Democrat John Garamendi, that would quote unquote close a loophole. And I don't like that language, but I'm going to just use it for now, to close a loophole in offshore wind and oil and gas to use non-U.S. workers. All right. So as you can well imagine, because the offshore wind is happening and it's going to be a big thing, there would be a push to have U.S. workers involved with that. That seems to be where the administration is going. The Biden administration is going. They are constantly putting out press releases about clean, renewable, union jobs, middle-class workers, training, all that all wrapped into a nice package, right? So, and that's where they're going. However, let me describe what this bill does. So what it does is that on offshore work, that you need to have American workers essentially on the boats. You can't bring in, like you can right now, people from all over the world to work on these projects at lower costs. But they're trying to force those construction crews to be American based and obviously use American ships. That's the push. The people that are pushing back from this are American Clean Power, and remarkably, my senator Ed Markey is pushing back against this, and others. Jake Auchincloss, who was also in Congress from Massachusetts, is pushing back on this bill to drive more American content into some of these offshore projects, mostly due to wages. It's what it seems like. Americans are going to get paid more. They don't want to pay more, so it puts the projects at risk. There's a real dichotomy going on here now, guys, where if we're going to train workers, but we're not going to use them. Or and one of the arguments being made against this act is, well, it's going to take too long. We need to bring in people from the outside who've done this before, obviously, and they're going to be the ones in charge, and Americans are not going to be up to speed fast enough. That's the argument. That's
so you sit on both sides of the bill, right? So the first side of the bill is, say you are, which is such an odd mix, a Republican from Louisiana and a Democrat from California working together. Fantastic that it's bipartisan in that way, but really weird in a political realm in the U.S. So sitting on their side of the table,
right?
This is the last kind of, why do they say close a loophole? Is because it's a small loophole in the Jones Act. The Jones Act actually does say you need to use U.S. people, but you can swap around and kind of fudge it a little bit, right? So what they're trying to do is they're saying okay, we're going to close that loophole in the Jones Act, and we're going to make all of these people because we want to create American jobs. Louisiana, tough to come by some jobs there. California there's a lot of high paying jobs there, but there's also quite a high rate of unemployment in California as well. So it's making sure these people go to work, and that all of these things, the IRA bill, all the stuff that you've put in place, actually does what it says and creates American jobs, and we can all get on board with that. So we sit in on that side of the table. Now we switch to the other side of the table, the people fighting against it, which includes the American Clean Power Association. So, and Phil, you'll like this. This is the connection I'm drawing. So the connection I'm drawing is that the American Clean Power Association and the detractors from the bill, or the people fighting against it, don't believe that if this bill goes into place, we can hit any of our renewable energy targets. They don't believe we can have 30 gigawatts of offshore wind if we say this is what we have to do, because the workforce won't be there. You can't train them in time, and they're just not that many people. Like, in the example I use is like the Danish society. So the Danish society is a maritime society. In the U.S., we don't have that on any coast. We have a small portions of it, but we don't have it like in Denmark. There's a lot of young women and men that grow up knowing they're going to be on a vessel, whether it's a fishing vessel, oil and gas, shipping, wherever. You know, like Maersk, one of the biggest shipping companies in the world. Boom, headquarters in Copenhagen. Like that's that culture there. So we don't have that maritime culture. So the proponents of the bill are saying, if you put this in place, we won't get the build out. And so why I think that American Clean Power, and American Clean Power, don't get mad at me, but why it sounds like to me that they're pushing back on it is the fact that the people paying the bills for American Clean Power are the developers, and they want to get that 30 in the ground by 2030. So it's at the top end of the thing, the people fighting against this bill that is set to help, in a perfect world, is set to help working families and the people out there making, to make really high paying wages and have good jobs. The people that are actually paying the bills for the lobby are the developers, and they want to make the money themselves. So I think that's where we have the split. And that's why it's a difficult one to kind of stomach, because I grew up in the Midwest. Everybody's fighting for good paying jobs. And if there was all these $50, $60 an hour jobs in my hometown, people would be licking their chops for them. They're not here. They're not going to. We're not building 30 gigawatts of offshore wind in Lake Superior. So I can see why the people on some of the people on the coast would be a little bit salty. But one of the numbers we've seen is needing 100,000 workers. It's going to be difficult to get 100,000 maritime workers out at sea.
One of the reasons this also came up was not just to quote unquote close a loophole with the Jones Act. It's also in the UK. There has been a significant amount of pushback on foreign workers being utilized to build a lot of these UK offshore wind farms. And some of these Congress people and senators have done junkets over there to the UK and Germany, etc. And they've seen how these things are getting built and what's involved in the investment. And they're licking their chops because they see tax base, jobs, revenue, etc. That's going to come into their state, their municipality. Now, the flip side to this as well is, who do you think ends up paying for the higher wages and the higher cost of developing a project? It's us,
the consumers. Yeah, sure.
And so at the end of the day, we have to be able to take on the cost burden of, domesticating that much production capacity, that much, industry expertise, construction expertise, etc. To be perfectly blunt, I'm on the side of the whole, like, let's ban or overturn the Jones Act, to be perfectly blunt, and to be transparent about it. I understand that we want to be able to build a domestic industry. I don't think we have to have a Jones Act to be able to mandate the fact that we should do it.
Yeah, more the libertarian stance of let the markets figure it out.
Yeah, that's a good take. The other side of the equation is, if you don't start, you're never going to get there anyway. If you don't have American involvement in this, who's going to maintain these things? We got 30 years of maintaining offshore turbines. Those crews that install them are going to go to the next project. They're going to be in South Korea. They're going to be in Australia. They're not going to be sitting off the coast of New Jersey all the time. Equinor saw that when we talked to Harriet Green probably a year ago, and she was working with the local states and communities to build up a workforce, and how she described how difficult it was. You should go back and listen to that episode. It's really good. She's informative. In the state of Massachusetts, which I can use because I live here, it's an educational state. We have MIT, Harvard, right? We have all these Northeastern. We have all these engineering schools running around the state. It's just it's got to be the highest density of schools to population in the country. We can train people in Massachusetts, but we don't seem to want to turn that on. What we appear to do is like, well, we can't do it today, so we should never do it. I don't think that makes a lot of sense here. I'm game if they would ramp it, if they would decide, put on some sort of graduated scale, say, hey, the Jones Act ain't going to work right now, but in 2026, we're going to enforce the Jones Act.
This.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Something of that sort where it's like, right now we want you to have X percent. And if you can prove to us that you've tried to get as high as you can, but you're only able to find this many workers, then you can move on. Now there's of course people that will fudge that, so that's a different game to play. And then we have to hire more auditors to just chase this stuff down and whatnot. But it's just like we say right now, we talk about all the time. It's an energy transition, not an energy step change. Right. So we all well know on this call and I don't want to speak for everybody, but we know that hydrocarbons are not going away tomorrow. They're going to be it's going to be a gradual changeover and we're going to have to merge into it. It's the same thing with trying to build this offshore workforce, offshore and onshore. Right. Because if we're trying to build 120,000 more turbines in the next 7 years, we're going to need a lot of people trained up in every corner of the wind producing nation.
Which it brings up another good point, Joel, because if you look at the countries that have instituted local content provisions, either to qualify for favorable feed-in tariff incentives or some other type of like local content regime, the reason that usually fails, if it fails, the reason it does is because they never back that up with a commitment to the industry to say, everybody puts out lofty targets and says they want to build 120,000 turbines or what have you, but do they put the right resources in place for that to actually happen? And so there's a difference between having a goal of, 30 gigawatts by 2030 or et cetera. There are a lot of lofty things that governments and industry trade groups and the industry itself wants to be able to achieve, but you're right. It's not going to go from 0 to 30 in a step. It's gotta be ramped, and that's why, again, I will agree and acknowledge that there needs to be an investment in the training. There are some universities that have been getting some state grants. New Jersey is one of them that gave some grants. Massachusetts is another one. Rhode Island also recently just announced that some local community colleges and technical colleges are getting some grants. So that's a good step, but are they being trained by people that have experience from Europe? Because at the end of the day, we're still going to have to rely on the Europeans who are ahead of us at this point, unless we're going to rely on the Chinese, which I doubt, but who else are you going to talk to that's got significant experience in doing this? We're going to have to rely on these people for now until we can figure out how we can domestically support these kind of, annual goals of, we could easily do like 10 to 12 gigawatts a year in offshore, for a time frame if we were sufficiently ramped up.
So there's other places in the world we can, not the exact same example, but experience that we can draw from on the U.S. Now, we're not used to being in this position, right? That's a part of the issue, I think, here, is the U.S. is not used to being the people that are trying to figure out how do we do this and how do we ramp up. We're used to just kind of going and getting it done. But if you look at switch your vision to some of the hydrocarbon industry, like in Africa, they were taken advantage of for a long time. So they instituted some pretty heavy laws around local content. But some of those laws have done in some of those countries, it's like the pendulum swings, right? So they got taken advantage of here. And then the pendulum swung so far through maybe a middle ground to the other extreme where it's actually stifled their growth by having too much local content laws and too many things in place to stop, because there's development that could have went gangbusters there had they allowed some help from the outside to come in, but they're still trying to catch up because they put too stringent of laws in place or too stringent of rules in place.
Brazil is a good example of that.
Exactly, and that's what I mean.
So if we're last, and we're pretty close to last in terms of in developed countries and putting in wind turbines, maybe we're a little ahead of Australia, not hugely in front of Australia, but if we're having to go up that scale, is it such that the federal government is going to be an impediment to this no matter what happens, and that we should be looking at other. Should we be looking at the model that Denmark's using, and what France has used, and what the UK has used, and what Japan is using, and to look at those and go, okay, here's the things that are working, here's the things that are not working, because we had the advantage of time. We've been sitting on the sidelines on offshore for a while. Do we now say, okay, we're gonna steal the best things from all these countries and implement them to speed up the progress? Because if we did that, I think that would make a lot of sense. But I have heard nothing like that.
If you do that, you end up with boats full of people from the APAC region at $100 a day, because that's what's happening in the UK.
Well, that sounds like what.
Right, and maybe that's if your end goal is to get 30 gigawatts in the ground by 2030, then that's what you're going to have to do as it sits today. Right, that's what we're staring at. If to get to that goal, but also meet the other bullet points down the list of all the other items that we want, it's not. I don't know if it's a if you build it they will come situation, because if I'm someone manning a vessel, I'm going to grab, if I have the ability to, I'm just going to grab the cheapest people I can find that can get the job done.
I think back to Phil's point about you don't want to have increased costs in electricity prices. Massachusetts already has high electricity prices. And this is not a state that shies away from taxes. It just doesn't. But in this particular case, they are. Weird. It just seems like the world is.
So is it a massive subsidy?
Yeah, maybe.
Right, like say, hey, if you guys will put a trained American worker on your vessel, we'll refund you 50% of their wages from Biden's pocket.
Well, is that a better spin than what we're doing right now? It may be. Maybe. Well, and going back to some of the earlier discussions here with the IRA and how the tax law hasn't been written. Is that what they do, right? Yeah, this happens in many levels of government where the legislation is very vague, and then you get down to the real rulemaking part, which is usually a committee locked away somewhere inside one of these government agencies, and it squirts out this policy. Like that wasn't what the intent was, the law was, but that's the way it goes, right? So they're allowed to manipulate it. Should they be manipulating away, like you're saying, like there's an incentive to put Americans on ships and to train Americans to do some of these jobs? Can the IRS just do that, and almost whole cloth in this sense, to get the industry kicked off? And what else are they going to do?
But that's what they've done with ITC and PTC, right? Since the 90s.
Yeah. Well,
so maybe they do.
I'll give you the good example, and I'll bring in some names because I think I like these guys. Josh Rangel Renewables, right? Those guys are busting their ass out there fixing wind turbines. Pronto Wind, another one. I mean, there's Joel. You and I know a bunch of these companies are out there. These guys are busting their asses out there,
absolutely.
Right? And they're doing the thing the right way, and so they have this there's this American component to it, right? And so when you get to the offshore side, it's like, well, screw it. Those guys at Rangel Renewables that are working their asses off and doing the right thing and growing their company the way it should be grown and getting, are they going to have any opportunity in any of this offshore work? I think the answer is no, because they're going to compete against wherever APAC workers. It doesn't seem right.
So I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example that's happening right. This is from this year. This knowledge that I have, right? The people working on the blades on Block Island, GEV Wind Power.
Yeah.
So GEV Wind Power, based over in Hull in England, but with a big and massively growing operation in the U.S., has taken some of the smart, able contractors that have been working offshore in Europe for a long time. And what they did when they went to Block Island for GE is they intermixed those guys with some of their American people that have been working onshore for a while, and they put them together on teams offshore so that the American side could get a little bit of knowledge of how to work offshore. So that's fantastic. That's great work. Well, that's what we want to see, but that's tough to do for the whole industry when we're only talking about those 5 turbines on Block Island, right? If that's the only training ground we have, that's not going to go very far. But that's a case example, right?
Yeah.
And don't forget, too, that they've now put new limits on H-1B visas, meaning that we can't bring a lot of the knowledgeable people from Europe or APAC over to the U.S. anyway, unless it's just to provide a certain amount of training to the locals,
Right.
which I think long-term, so, going back to the earlier point, Alan, I think, companies like Rangel aren't necessarily going to be able to have a place in the market. It's just a question of how quick are they going to be able to get ramped up. I mean, like we've been talking about, if you want to have 30 by 2030, where are the training programs that are happening this year that need to prepare the workforce for doing the construction, doing the offshore maintenance? I mean, you need to start the knowledge transfer and the tech transfer now.
Yeah.
And I don't see that happening.
And
it's 2023.
right. Yeah.
Like there's some stuff that transfers, right? You have like, so if you're up there right now, so this is more not Block Island knowledge, right? If you're there and say they want some spot on metal repair, that's a union job. So now you have union people that have never actually been offshore painting anything, that someone's got to, you know what I mean? So they've got to have a painting off of ropes and in the splash zone and all this stuff, but it has to be whatever XYZ union it is to be a painter over there. So now you've created an Americanized job, but you've made it very, very, very difficult to find that person and to get those qualifications and to get that stamp and to pay those union dues and to get all those guys on board it's not simple. It's not basic to do.
Well, I go back to Phil's point. The unions that were being involved in some of these offshore projects, the American unions, are saying they need more time to spool up workers to train them. What have we been doing?
2023.
Yeah.
We've only got 7 years left.
Right. I mean,
Which sounds preposterous, but we're still going to be, I mean, when you realize how many qualified workers are necessary for those specific jobs, we're not moving fast enough.
No.
That's the goal. We're definitely not moving fast enough.
Right.
So have you guys seen an announcement that says for $9,200 you can come to XYZ college and get your 1-year certificate in this? I haven't seen it.
I know they exist
For offshore. I've seen it for
onshore.
Not yet.
Yeah, not yet.
But even so say that that's an announcement that we hear today. That person is still 9 months to a year away from having their training certificate and being a green hand and on January 19th, 2024. They'll have a year of experience. Might be able to work on their own by January 1st of 2025. That's crazy.
Well, which also begs the question when you look at, going back to our other conversation, what does this injunction on GE being able to sell their turbines mean for projects being constructed according to their original time schedules?
Oh, yeah.
Are we going to have a situation where we just can't find enough personnel? And if there's, legislation that comes into play that closes the loophole, so to speak, on offshore workers to be in compliance with the Jones Act, then how do we build this stuff by, start construction in 23, 24, or 25 and have it done by 26, 27, 28? And there's no way we keep this timeline.
There has to be a way, right? We've seen multiple projects of this scale done in America over the years. Have we just lost our bearings a little bit?
Are you going back to the moon landing? Is that what we're going back to?
Well, I could pick a whole bunch of them, right? And it's not just that. There's a lot of them. Well, Musk is landing rockets 2 at a time down in Florida at the moment. Where do you think that came from? Right? That came from America, right? That wasn't. The time frames got shortened because we got smarter. Not because the project was difficult. We applied brain power and a lot of muscle to get some of these in action. It just doesn't seem. There's a lot of. The thing kills me is there's a lot. And we're on a podcast, of course. There's a lot of talk, but when you start scratching the surface around like what's actually happening, you don't see much. You don't see it. I don't see it. I don't see it in my state. I know at the lowest level there is some. But in that medial level, like, yeah, we got the port set up, we're ready to take nacelles in, we got the blades coming in, we're all getting ganged up, we got these unions involved, and they got guys trained and people ready to go. That's not there.
Nope. And so it duplicates what Phil said on timeline problem. Rosemary, you're a business person. Alan, you're a business person. Phil, you're a business person. I'm a business person. When was the last time you put a quote out that said, this quote is good for the next 2 years, 3 years?
No.
Never. It's
Never.
30
Never.
days, 60 days, 90 days max before I'm going to change these prices on you.
Right.
So you have these people that have done the complete business model in 2022, bid on an auction, paid hundreds of millions of dollars to do it, and now they're not going to be able to put steel in the water for 2-3 years, and at inflation at 8% and all these different. So there's so many market factors here at play that you can see why EPSG or PESG or whatever it was decided to kind of back off, right? To say like, man, it's just too many uncertainties here. All of a sudden, like, our business model doesn't make sense anymore.
If you want to kill an industry, and I'll close it out this way. If you want to kill an industry, have high inflation, have high interest rates, which is what's happening right now. And it's not just onshore wind, offshore wind. It's pretty much all across American society at the moment. And it's going to make doing some of these training initiatives and getting engineers up to speed and learning the specifics of offshore wind implemented. It's going to make it even more difficult than it was already. It's just a variety of factors, unfortunately, and it's just not solved. And I know we're all sort of griping at one another. That's what podcasts do a little bit, but they do need to be addressed. And you feel like there should be some leadership on this issue. And hopefully over the next couple of months, we're going to start to see it. That's the goal. That's going to do it for this week's Uptime Wind Energy Podcast. Thanks for listening. Please take a moment and give us a 5-star rating on your podcast platform. Be sure to subscribe in the show notes below to Uptime Tech News, our weekly newsletter, as well as Rosemary's YouTube channel, Engineering with Rosie. And we'll see you here next week on the Uptime Wind Energy Podcast.